And today my guest is Gary D Schmidt, the author of some wonderful books, Orbiting Jupiter, Okay for Now, um, Lizzie Bright and the Buckminster Boy. He has a ton of books that are among many of my favorites and show up when you talk with academics all the time. Sometimes, and if you're talking to a Michigan academic, they always know who you are, right? So there you go. Thanks for being here, Gary.
Thanks for having me. By the way, just to get this on the record, I love the title of this podcast here. I think that's fantastic.
Well,
This,
let's hope that we've been running the blog now. Well, I ran it for about on my own for about 6 or 7 years, and then after the first and second year is recruiting people to do a Wednesday post, so I didn't have to do them all. But then when I retired and took a sabbatical for a year, one of the people who runs it is Gretchen Rumer, who's at Aquinas up there. So
yeah,
Gretchen
I
is
know that.
she and I ended up doing quite a few things together my last 4 or 5 years as an academic. So we have these features that we're trying to decide if we keep going, if we don't keep going. But doing some conversations with authors has been a lot of fun, and we've learned that. So I want to get a couple of things out of the way because a lot of young adult authors are not only writing full time. I mean, that's a luxury to get to the point where you're writing full time. But you've been productive enough that some people could say you maybe could have made a go as a full time young adult author, but you are a full time academic as well. So tell us a little bit about your life as an academic.
Well, I should tell you, I did retire a year ago
Ah,
from
okay.
from Calvin, from full-time teaching. So this is I've just had 1 year of full-time writing, which was strange. I mean, it's the first time since kindergarten that I haven't had an academic schedule, and so it was just really kind of a weird thing to get used to. But you're right. I mean, to do both of those, to be a full-time professor and to be writing academic books and to do the other side of that, did mean that there was a lot of juggling. And it meant that I had to really prioritize. Well, I couldn't waste time. I
Yeah.
couldn't waste time. So if I was away at a conference, for example, then I have 10 things I'm taking with me. I don't put downtime there. And it meant that there were weekends that were committed as well. And that got harder the more writing courses I started to teach as our writing
Oh,
program began to take off. Because writing courses, as you know, are just going to are killers in terms of time,
yeah.
even though they are wonderful in terms of educational mission, I suppose. So it meant really that was it. I had to learn to write in the cracks so that if I have 15 minutes, I didn't have the luxury of saying, oh, that's just too short of a time. I'm just going to not worry about that and have a cup of coffee. That's where I say, I got this one paragraph here, and I know I can get that done in 15 minutes. I mean, it was really down to that stuff. Um, and so I also tried to make sure that I didn't lose the academic side because you could. It would be easy to
Yeah.
do and not write in there. So I always had some interesting, at least interesting to me, projects that pushed me on that. So I mean, I just had to find the time to not mess around and to get things done, and that was very conscious every day.
Well, so you're at, you were at a smaller university but your PhD was in medieval literature. Is that right?
Yeah.
When I looked that up and I think, so what were you teaching primarily in an English department of a small school? You weren't certainly only teaching medieval lit, right? So
Oh, but Steve, I had the best schedule of any academic on the planet. Okay, I really did. So like we had 3 courses and an interim course January, and then we had another 3 courses. That was our load. So I
Okay.
got to teach an upper level writing class. So those are the students who are really committed to
Hmm.
vocational writing. I got to teach children's literature. So those are the students who are going into that and who know they have to have it for their next gig. And then I got to teach medieval, which or Brit Lit, early Brit Lit, and those are the students who are really serious about literature because no one's going to take medieval lit unless
Yeah.
they're really going to be committed, right? I mean, there's the language stuff to deal with.
Yeah.
Um,
So where did that break for you? Did it break at Shakespeare or did it break before Shakespeare?
before Shakespeare's. So I
Yeah,
would end on sort of, Gower, or we would
yeah,
end with Chaucer, mostly Chaucer. We would end if it was a survey course.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, that was great. I mean, great to teach those to students who were really into that. That
yeah,
was pretty cool. To teach them a little bit of Anglo-Saxon, and so that they
yeah,
could understand certain elements of it. You can't read Beowulf without having learned it for a
yeah.
good long time, but you could still see how the language is beginning to work. It was very, very exciting.
Well,
So
that is.
in January, I got to go to New England, and I would spend January on site in New England teaching. We would be in Concord, and we would
Oh,
study Thoreau and Hawthorne and and
uh,
all the guys in Concord. So I mean, it was a
yeah,
pretty good schedule.
yeah. Oh, that's that's a great. So your January intern class was at different locations depending on what students signed up for, or did the whole
Yeah,
university go there?
you could go anywhere in the world with a professor, but I always went back to Concord, and then for a while we went to Maine first, and we would live in 1865 at the Living History Museum, which was a hoot.
Yeah.
Getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to milk cows, oh my gosh, it was great. And then we would go down from there down to Concord, but sometimes we also went to Plymouth because there's
Oh
that
yeah,
reconstructed village there. I
yeah.
think that this was true when we began, that we were the first college to actually sleep in those reconstructed houses in Plymouth
Oh,
in January on the coast, knowing that, of course, there's no glass or anything in the open windows or
right.
the open doors, and you're sleeping on the ground. It was interesting.
Yeah. I'm always interested in writing habits. And now that you're retired, it's probably changed completely. But tell us a little bit about, so here you're an academic, you've got a schedule you have to teach. Um, when did you pattern your writing? When did you do, and how much academic writing were you required to do? Or was it mainly you were evaluated on teaching, so that freed you up to only do the academic stuff you were really interested in?
Yeah, it was the case that for the most part you were evaluated on teaching, and there was expectation about publication as well. So I had 3 university press books in my career there, um, which, given what else I was writing, I thought was fair.
Oh
It,
yeah,
it, it was it was an interesting and perhaps an ongoing tension with my college, as it is in many places, where administrators would ask, "Is it the case that academic writing should be evaluated differently than creative?" As if somehow academic writing isn't creative, right? Never mind.
right.
But so if I write a book, if I write a picture book, say, for a child audience, does that have the same merit as a book about Hannah Adams, right? And of course, I was arguing, well, of course it does. It's a different audience, but of course it does, and it takes exactly the same kind of time and commitment and learning because you're writing for a different audience. That
Right.
didn't always fly to
Yeah.
everyone. And so, yeah, once tenure was over, and because it was accepted there,
Yeah.
that kind of was something that always felt behind the scenes. Like there was
Yeah.
that little question, is a novel for a middle grade kiddo the same as a university press book? Um, and that never was really resolved. But
Yeah.
in terms of just getting stuff done, I was super strict about what I wanted, and it was 500 words a day on any given project, and that's every day. So every single day, it's 500 words. Sometimes it's a stinky 500 words, and I'll have to throw them away. But sometimes it's good. Um, and that was one way of making sure that I was keeping progress on the creative side. I could just get those down. The academics, that's the number of words isn't such a good standard. So it might be more this point. Today I'm going to deal with just this one point,
Yeah.
something like that. But I created limitations so I knew I could succeed at those every day.
Yeah. That's it's a struggle to try to find that. And when my first academic job, because I was in the high school classroom for 25 years and then got a PhD and jumped to academic work for the last 15 or 16. And at LSU, I landed a joint appointment in English and Ed. And
Oh my God.
remarkably, in English, they were really an open department. They didn't care what I did. So writing about young adult literature was fine. If I did it in an edited book, it was fine. If I did it in journals, it was fine. But boy, the education department really would have preferred that I would have done more social science work, right?
Oh,
They
sure.
didn't like it if I was writing for the Allen Review or one of the journals like, or the children's lit journals where I was evaluating a text
Yeah, yeah.
um, and its literary merit for it, or even about how you might go about incorporating that into curriculum. Unless I had a body of students that I was studying and how they did it, they were less likely to like that, right? So I had to kind of err on the side of productivity, right? I had to, they were saying, oh, you need 3 articles a year. Well, I was always trying to get 5 or 6, right? So then the quantity, because it makes a case that you're indeed building a national reputation and all those other kinds of things. So it's hard to argue with productivity
Right.
if you're not doing exactly what they want, right? So
I get that's in pressure. Right.
yeah,
I should say
so
it didn't come so much from my department as it came from the upper administration. So
yeah.
the department was always behind me. It always felt like that was being supported. Um, and I recognize, I mean, writing is writing is writing. You're choosing your
Yeah.
audience. But that wasn't the case necessarily at the administrative level.
Well, that's what in the English department they said. Well, are you going to go up early? In a year early? And I said, nah, I don't think so. I don't think the education side likes that. But they were a department that had film studies people, folklore people, so they were aware of maybe the only way wasn't to write an academic university press book, right? Because folklore people exist in journals and film people exist in journals and in
Yeah,
ways. So they were more open in their interpretation of what was a productive academic career, right? And thank goodness that they were doing that. So
yeah, yeah.
500 words. I just got talking to my son who's taking a year off and trying to be a writer. He lives in LA. What he'd really, I think, like to do is write television, but he's trying to write. And he was reading Stephen King, where Stephen King says 2,000 words a day, you know.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
And I said, but and we were talking about this. He says, but Stephen King says, well, I'm Stephen King. I give the readers of this book permission to do 1,000,
My God. Well,
but
I mean, Hemingway, Jack London, Steinbeck, all of them did all of those guys did 500 words.
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah. And Hemingway was religious about it, right? He got up early, wrote, and then the rest of the day was his, right?
exactly. Steinbeck would write a letter to his editor, which he wouldn't send, but he would just use him as the audience. He would put that away, and then he would write his 500 words. I like that.
Yeah.
Kind of neat.
Well, and I've talked to a lot of writers, and I would say most of them have some kind of goal like that, whether it's 500 words or write for an hour before you get up and move. And even one of the academic advices I got, which I think was really sound advice, was write a page a day. If you're an academic who writes a page a day, well, every 30 days you've written enough to have an article. But maybe that article doesn't come out in 30 days. You revise it and you work on it. And, but writing a page a day gets you a lot of pages over time.
And I mean, we've both known people who couldn't finish their dissertations or
Oh,
couldn't
yeah.
finish. And I think the problem there it's not lack of necessarily discipline as much as it is you can't envision what you're doing today as just one page or 500
Yeah.
words. All you see is 400 pages in front of you, and then you collapse because
Yeah.
no one will deal with that. But if you just imagine, or for me, it was just let's do this one in an academic book, this one little point, this one thing. Maybe it's just one complicated footnote, and if I can get that done, okay, that's
Yeah,
really
then you've got, yeah, I think, yeah, seeing it as manageable bites, well, how do you eat the elephant? Well, one bite at a time, right? And the dissertation is like that. And the dissertation for me taught me also revision. I was working with 2 or 3 other students that we'd meet periodically, and I was in the serious writing of my first chapter and took it to my writing group, and I can remember Sharon sat there and read through the first 4 or 5 pages. Then she took a pen and just crossed through the first 4 pages. She says, "This is all lovely, but it's all throat clearing. You don't get to your point." And after a shock, I went, "Oh, she's right, right?" And that ended up being the introduction to a shorter article that I wrote for the English Journal, but it was not, it was too much for what I was trying to do
Yeah,
going forward.
yeah, no, I get that.
Yeah. So yeah, it was, but you learn that revision, you write a lot of stuff that may not end up in the published piece. It may change, and I ended up calling my cuts the brain dump. I would put a lot of things in a brain dump, right? So that never ended up in the article. That in my mind I was going to write a more brilliant article with that later on. Well, that didn't happen very often, right?
And that's true in fiction too. If you take this section out and say, I like this writing, I think I'll just put it in this folder over here, and because I know I'll use it someday. No, you never use it. You never go back
Yeah.
to it.
One was and you've written a lot more books than people realize. People who know you for kind of your middle grade stuff or stuff orbiting Jupiter, which in my mind is, even though the kids are kind of young, it's still an older kind of book. But you've written quite a few pieces of fiction. So when did you start, and what was the first book like? And when did you start seeing yourself as kind of a participant in the field of young adult literature or children's literature?
It was my first year in my first real job after graduate school. Um, the chair comes, the chair of the English department, and he says, "We have this need in children's literature. So we need someone to teach children's literature. Can you do it?" Well, it's your first year. You're not tenured. Go to your chair. Of course, I can do that.
Yeah. And I can juggle writing a unicorn as well, right?
so so I began, furiously in the fall semester to study something, a whole field that I needed to know for the second semester. Meanwhile, the education department folks, having heard that, were all ticked because they thought, well, you're just sticking someone in there. You're not taking the course seriously. And so I had someone who teaches methods in children's literature from that department say, let's go out for a ride. And we went to a conference, children's lit conference. And the whole way there and the whole way back, it was quizzing. She's quizzing
Yes.
to see how much I knew, which was crazy. But I loved the course. I loved the
Yeah.
course. And it was terrific fun. Those were the days of those big Sutherland anthologies and such.
Yeah.
And I was learning a lot, and I found it fascinating. I was surprised at how much I liked it. Um, and so that continued for the next few years. And it felt to me eventually, if I'm going to be serious about this, maybe it would be really helpful in the classroom if I was writing in that field.
Uh,
I mean, no one's writing medieval literature anymore. They're all dead and have been dead for 1,200 years, But it is the case that I could write in this field. So I did a novel called The Sin Eater. It's
mhm.
15 years
Yeah,
ago.
yeah.
And you have that arrogance and you send it off. Um, and that was when I forget what Lodestar. I think it was Lodestar was the publisher then. And it was I sent it to Virginia Buckley because she was Catherine Patterson's editor.
Oh, yeah.
It's just, I mean, it was in some ways incredibly arrogant. And there was a day when I was working registration. So there's 50 kids that need to see
Yeah.
in like
Mhm.
3 hours, right? So the office is full with students, the hall is filled with students. I'm desperately trying to get through all this registration stuff. And she called. And she goes, "This is Virginia Buckley." And I said, think it was a student. I go, "Hey, Virginia, what's up?" And then I said, wait, the Virginia Buckley? And she goes, no, I said, Virginia Buckley. I repeated, and she goes, "Well, a Virginia Buckley." And so from then on, I always wrote to her as the Virginia Buckley. But it was just, I mean, she liked the book, and she took me on sort of, it feels like an apprenticeship, which never happened now, right? Let's
Yes.
here, come and try this book, learn about how it goes, how to work it, how our relationship would look. And that's exactly what we did. So it felt the motivation was to be better in my classroom about it, but then it quickly became, how do I get good at this art form? And that was working with Virginia, really as an apprentice to a great
So
editor.
what year was that? What was the span of when you first
Uh,
started working with her?
Mid 90s, that was something like that.
Mhm.
And then I worked with her until she passed away, um, and which was wonderful. I can't even tell you how great it was. It was always a 12-page letter back, single space, always 12 pages, followed by a long phone call. And then you would send back the revisions, right? And then she would send another letter, usually 2 to 4 pages, also single space. It's very similar. This is this. And she was, in a loving way, kind of brutal. She never held anything back. One day, once I made this terrible, Steve Olson's this terrible mistake. I sent a book in. It was a book about Rumpelstiltskin, and she and I decided that we would go to a conference, and we would have that first conference together. So it's as if she had opened up my submission, and for the first time we are going to talk about it, which is it was the first time. So we did that in front of 200 people. It was so humiliating. You can't believe. She said at one point, "So Gary, what kind of tree is this?" And I said, "It's a cherry tree." And she goes, "Huh, it's blooming, right?" And I go, "Yeah." And she goes, "What month is it in your book?" And it was March. And it was like that all then it was, "Do cherry trees bloom in March, Gary?" And it was, oh, it was horrible. It was horrible. But yeah, so that was sort of mid 90s when I first began to
Yeah.
work, and I worked with her for a long time.
Well, that's it's great to, but there's a few people in the world, and my major professor was like that. He could be brutally honest, but you knew he cared about what you were doing, right? And
Exactly right.
and and if you know that, then you can take it, right? As long as you know they really care and they're not just trying to sabotage your work, right?
Oh,
You can
right,
hear the
exactly.
hard thing, right?
And that was Virginia. And I mean, I've had the most wonderful set of editors that I've worked with over the years. I mean, just amazing. So you hear sometimes these stories about a writer and the editor and how there's tension and such. It has never been like that for
Mm.
me. It has always been, oh my gosh, this is such a privilege to be able
I
to.
think that's great. And so that book is not the book people will most know you for. So you're writing along and you're having, I mean, it's pretty astonishing to go to Amazon or Goodreads and read the list of books you have. But when, and I guess this is lurking in the back of my mind. Do you perceive that initially as children's literature, or did you perceive it as young adult? So did you have a divide in your mind about those two things?
That's a really good question, Steve. I'm not sure I have ever settled that in my mind. I mean, I do think of myself mostly in middle grade, but there are some books that are clearly children's. I mean, there's some picture books, obviously, that are clearly a
Yeah.
children's. And then there's, I think, some of them which are clearly middle grade, but then there's some which are not. And so, Orbiting Jupiter, for example, the problem was to tell a pretty adult story from the point of view of a very naive, not very naive, but a naive, protected kid, a 12-year-old. I mean, at
Right.
one point, Joseph says to Jack, you know, we're close in age, but I'm a whole lifetime ahead of you. And
Yeah.
that's exactly right. It's absolutely right that he's a lifetime ahead. So it's a 12-year-old trying to tell an adult story somewhat. And that was interesting to me. That problem was
Yeah.
really interesting. And then doing the sequel, Jack has grown up some. And
Yeah.
so that's not the same problem, but he's still only 13. So I guess I've always generally seen myself more in the middle grade area.
So I'll go back. And so, I started doing my PhD in 2002, and I'd always been interested, even though I taught, AP, I always still was teaching kind of regular sophomores and things like that in school. I was always interested in the kids who wouldn't read,
Yeah.
the reluctant readers. So when I went to do my PhD, I was really interested in teacher induction and retention. but I was part of a group at Georgia where they said, well, you have to teach to earn this money we're giving you, right? So I had to, and they said, do you want to teach the young adult lit strand? And I said, absolutely, I would like to do that, you know, because, and what I knew at the time was really in 2002, pretty limited to Crutcher and Cormier and some of the stuff that the outsiders and people would know. But I really started reading. And then over the course of the 3 years, one of the books that really drew my attention was Lizzie Bright and the Buckminster Boys. So that was my first introduction to your books. Now imagine I'm reading that, and then I see another book by you, you know, Orbiting Jupiter later, and I think, I am not, those books in my mind are so radically different that I was setting up for, oh, I'm reading a different author here in some ways. Have you had that reaction, or are you just gifted enough that you can kind of delve into both kinds of worlds, the historical fiction versus the other thing?
You know, I think it's mostly, and I'm going to say this as though it's funny, but it's there is some truth in this, kind of this fear that I would start to write the same book over and over again. And you know, there are writers who do that, right? Where you can just
Sure.
see, this is so and so, I know exactly what's coming. And after a while, it just feels so predictable that it's no longer interesting. It's merely formulaic. And I think there is something in me that just is terrified of that notion that I'm going to drop into that pattern.
Uh,
And so I really do want to have projects that will force me not to be in that pattern, but to have things which are so totally different. And of course, the other thing is, you know, I am the guy who doesn't like. I don't have my next book planned out 5 years from now. The book that I'm going to be thinking about is something that has often struck me pretty recently.
but there's articles to be written on the history of covers of books, because clearly the publishers take over and say, we're going to market this book clearly for middle school kids.
Right.
We've got the color palette that's right. So, so I go from Lizzie Bright to Orbiting Jupiter, and then
Yeah.
you know, then to Wednesday's Wars, and I think, okay, you know, you're not in danger of writing the same thing over and over again, right?
I hope not. Yeah, it was. I've always struggled somewhat with that. That I have no power with regard to the covers, and I just have to trust the way it comes out. And it is the case that there are times when I don't like the cover. The original cover for Wednesday Wars was not a good cover. I thought it was almost totally black. Um, like
Yeah,
things,
it's kind of got a cursive writing on it. It's not
yeah,
really suggestive of much. When I did I think you're right. I mean, the current cover plays better for audiences, right?
it does. And they have responded at times. Like even the current cover, in one version of that, the kid has red sneakers on, and I wrote back to point out to them in 1967, 1968, if you're a guy and you walk in with red sneakers, you get beat up. I mean, no
Yeah,
one wears red sneakers. No guy wears red sneakers at that time. And so now the current version of that does have black.
yeah,
Mine wanted color in it. But for me, well, I should tell you, I'm as colorblind as a dog, so I don't really see colors. So it doesn't really matter to me. So I love the cover, the original cover for Orbiting Jupiter, which is all, you know, my world, which is
yeah,
great.
yeah,
I love that cover.
yeah. That's well, it's a great cover, and it's one of the things that, you know, when you're somebody in my world and your job for, you know, 15 years is to read young adult literature and write and talk about it and convince teachers to use it, you know, it's really hard for me. How do I say this politely? I'll give most authors 2 books, but it's hard for me to go back to the third and sometimes to finish the second if I'm not captivated, right?
So,
So, because I'm trying to read a lot, and I'm a real big fan, and maybe it's because I got involved with Alan so early. You know, I was only 3 years out as a professor when a colleague of mine and another professor at Vanderbilt became editors of the Allen Review. Well, all of a sudden, you know, you're reading and thinking a lot more about that, then you have to. But I love premier, the debut author, and I really love good first books. But I'm a big fan of the follow-up book. You know, what's the second novel do? It doesn't have to be the same book. It doesn't even have to be the same thing, but I want to know, can I find the literary quality that I'm looking for that I found in the first book in the second book as well, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And one of the reasons I keep reading your books is even though they're varied, boy, you have a lot of strength. And I'll pick on one that I think is um, quite good. Is if I were is okay for now, right? And I didn't review and see what kind of awards or promotion it got, but what a great book, Gary. And I think it's because it ties, let's see, family dynamics, the
yeah,
Vietnam War, a kid's sensitivity to art, a kid who's been bullied by his brothers and his fathers, who doesn't take crap from anyone at school, right?
yes,
Including things. So the themes are all bound up in this kid um, who doesn't kind of want people to know that he's sensitive, but he is, right?
he is. Right.
And he kind of doesn't know how to deal with that, even from the idea of how sensitive he is to the needs of people on his grocery delivery route, right? He's sensitive to the mother with a lot of kids. He's sensitive to the reclusive playwright. Um, and in his gut reaction, he doesn't always want to be, you know, but he
There are
figures it out, right?
there are times when he says to the reader, "It's none of your business,"
Yeah. Yeah,
which
right.
was a hoot. And I hadn't seen that done before, and I thought, I wonder if I could get away with this. I didn't think my editor would let me do that, but it does suggest that he's aware as a first person narrator that he's supposed to be spilling his guts and be vulnerable and such, and that's not Doug. He's not that guy.
Yeah. And
He's just
you've done enough. He does enough self-revelation that any reader that's paying attention, right, is aware of this conflict, right?
yeah,
Um, and even to the idea of hiding something valuable in a place where your siblings are not going to find it, trying to keep the jacket secure and those kinds of things where um and the sense of loss of when he loses Joe Pepitone's hat, the sense of loss is so early on in the book, so touchingly good written. I think that. So how does a book like that come about? So if you just retired and I just retired a couple of years ago, we're children of the same era, right? Where for me, I graduated from high school in 73 and I was born in 55. So I think my year was the last year to get draft numbers, but no one was drafted in 55. So
my birthday was the April my April 14th was my birthday, and whatever the year was, um, it ended on April 1st, so I was 2 weeks away from the draft, and it was over. So I never filled out the registration cards. I never registered for the draft. But Vietnam doesn't go away. I mean,
no,
it's something growing up in that period, maybe even more strongly for you, that you don't ever forget it. And we saw it on TV every night. And there's Walter Cronkite,
yeah,
and it's live. It's live shots, or just
yeah,
recently take shots. And people who were sent over. I have never forgotten living like that, and in some ways, the anger. 56,000 boys.
yeah. It's really dominant for me watching it as an outsider who everybody after me doesn't have to go. Everybody before me ran the risk of going, right?
Yeah,
So much so that when we're in high school, history classes and current events discussions were really important in my high school,
yeah, yeah.
because it mattered so when we were talking about, I took a class my senior year called the 20th century, in which we essentially did a decade every 2 or 3 weeks, right? It was kind of focused on that. And and for me, the sense of history and come and go and movements have always stayed very important. I think we should look at history. I think, evaluating leaders with a moral compass or a sense of empathy becomes dominant. And I'm really frustrated by people in my generation who that doesn't seem to matter. Because I think, do you have no memory of Nixon overstepping? Um, and in some ways,
Yeah.
realizing that he oversteps and say, I can't do this anymore, right? Or people telling him you can't do this anymore. So
Right. Of that administration, which will pale in comparison if depending on how the vote goes in a week or so, are
yeah.
really scary. And
Yeah,
it's
it's
so
it's very scary for me. But you have, so thinking about the Vietnam War, you have the Vietnam War as a backdrop in at least um, the Wednesday wars, and you also have it in, OK for Now. Does it play out in others? And have you thought about writing a direct Vietnam book where it's the central issue?
I don't for the first no, it's the only those two books are the only ones which are at the time period when you recognize your characters can easily be caught up in it. I think one of the themes that I do work with again and again, sort of willy nilly, almost like I don't have any choice but to do it, is the theme of loss. And I think both you and I recognize that we lost something as a country um, during that war. We lost something
Yeah,
really, really big, and it feels like um, that lesson comes back in very different manifestations in some of the other books. So, for example, orbiting Jupiter. I mean, those two kids, Jack and Joseph, those are real kids.
yeah,
Jack is Jake, Joseph is Joseph, and it's not that it's their story, but it isn't. But when I think of those two kids who I met in a secure juvenile detention home, I think of the loss of their childhood and how that's over for them. One of those guys won't get out till he's 18, and he won't be a kid anymore. And right now, when I first met them, they were in wait for it 8th
yeah,
grade, and so that
yeah.
sense of loss isn't the same as the Vietnam thing. But I am fascinated by how it is that we can recover or not from losing something that we care a great deal about.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I think I think young adult literature today um, can write about things of loss more directly than they could 20 years ago. I think that there's more issues that people are able to take up. I think we've had several different people over the last 13 years write about 9/11 in ways that
Well,
they didn't write about Vietnam in the same way. There's some really, really good books about 9/11 and surviving or losing people, both in adult fiction as well. I mean, there's some really good ones in
yeah,
adult, but in young adult literature, there's a collection of, I could think of 10 that I would say kind of a hallmark. If you want to teach a class on it, I could think of 10 books that are probably well worth
really.
reading. Yeah, about that.
9/11.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's some really, really good ones from Gabe Pulsner. I think David Levithan writes a really good one. Um, but I could go back if you want. If you're interested, I'll curate a list for you and send it to you because
I would like. I'd like to see that. Yeah.
yeah, I'll send you the links to the blog post, and then I'll tell you the 5 to 10 that I really think are really good, right, about that, and then you can argue with me. No, Steve, none of these. There's one good one here. What are you talking about, right?
Okay, we can argue.
When you have this time now to write, have you got something coming around the bend right now, or what's up with that?
It's I haven't done much outside of academic work, which was collaborative. And I've gotten to the point where I'm sort of enjoying that now. So there's a new book out with Ron, I think you might know him, Ron Kirchi. Do you know him?
Oh, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know who he is. Yeah.
Yeah. So he and I had done. Well, we finished three, and we're working on the fourth. The first one comes out in springtime, and they're collaborative books. It's called A Day at the Beach. This one is about. Well, we wrote 45 very short stories, like 4 to 5 pages. We pared that down to 30, and the stories are arranged according to the tide, so early morning to late evening.
Oh.
And each story has a different character, though sometimes characters bleed into the other stories, so you see them repeating. To write with Ron is, you can't believe, this wonderful delight. He's so smart, so quick, so funny, and so incisive. His language is great. So we worked together on those, and that'd be this coming spring. And then the next one's called Simon. This is going to sound stupid when I say it to you, Steve. Sorry, but so this kid, this Athenian kid, is killed in the Peloponnesian Wars. See, it's stupid. 450 BC, but he's been in Hades for the last 2.5 millennia, and so he has really been trying to get out. And finally, he befriends Cerberus, learns how to cross the rivers, finds a metal staircase, gets out of Hades, and opens up this big iron door, and he walks into the seventh grade boys' bathroom of a middle school in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And of course, as he walks in there, there's a kid there, and the school logo is the Spartans, of
Yeah.
course. So it's the story of this kiddo who's 2,500 years out of date, and really, it's a story about how is it that people from very disparate worlds and cultures may find ways to come together, which seems to be a really, really important thing right now. So that's going on. But meanwhile, this plot element is that the god Hades is ticked that this kid has escaped, so he sent a demon after
Oh,
him,
to chase him down.
chase him back, um, and is warning his best friend, who he's just made here, that if you're around this kid, you're going to be in big doo doo. So it was a really fun thing, very different. We started by saying, I'll do 10 pages, you do 10 pages. And we ended up mostly doing scenes that we would go back and forth on.
Yeah.
So that's
But
all.
you don't take a character and one of you writes the other one character and one writes another. It hasn't been
So we did do that. The third book is 10 kids from LA, 10 kids from Portland, Maine. Their teachers force them to write pen pal letters, but
uh-huh.
old school. So like on real paper with real envelopes and stamps and such. And those go back and forth. And it's the story of resentment. No kid wants to do that, right?
Right,
And
right.
to a willingness to be vulnerable with each other as these kids are forced in a way, and then glom onto the idea of being connected and to be being vulnerable. And that's the third book. So that we hope will come out in 2027.
Oh, all those sound fascinating. That's really, so how did you guys connect? How did this happen?
We both taught at Hamline University for their MFA for writing for
Okay.
children. So we had an apartment. So it was Ron and me and Jean Yang and
Oh,
Steve. So imagine this.
that's a pretty good group, right?
Oh my gosh, we're sitting at a round table, and Jean was working on Boxers and Saints back then, and I was working on whatever I was working on. Ron was working on his poetry, and I sit back every so often and I just go, "How cool is this?
Yeah.
And you guys right here, and the same. How cool is that?"
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's great.
yeah, it's funny you mentioned Gene because it's when we first became editors of the Allen Review, it was the year after American Born Chinese has come out, right? And the
Oh,
number of really good articles about that book that came to us, I turned to my editors and says, we're in danger of becoming the journal that reviews American Born Chinese, right?
but it's brilliant, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's an absolutely brilliant book.
Yeah, I have a colleague who teaches in Western Massachusetts at a small school, and and Sophie calls it the perfect book. She thinks it's the perfect young adult novel. And when you listen to her give a presentation, especially when you're trying to teach kids who are having a difficult time talking about race issues, she says it's a perfect book. it can get you where you need to go, right? In the conversation.
And
So,
the fact that the Monkey King and the questions of identity are in there,
yeah,
and that story is going along until they smash together at the end. I mean, it's
yeah.
brilliant.
It's really good. Now we're going to really intrude on your retirement. So, how much time are you committing daily? Are you still saying, okay, I'm free as a bird? So, are you still 500 words a day, no matter what? Is that the goal?
That's always the goal, right? And so I'm trying to keep 3 projects going, um, and have some in the future that I'm looking forward to. I have had this weird thing, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it, but I've got my wife's grandfather's diaries. He grew up
Oh,
in rural Maine in 1905. So I have these diaries from when he was 11 to when he's 31. But I've been transcribing the ones from 11 to about 14 or 15. And I think I might try and do something with that, but I don't know what.
yeah,
They're very short, legible kinds of descriptions, but they evoke an entire world, this rural world of Maine, which is all about hardscrabble farming and community. I mean, the
yeah,
community that are established together. So I'm trying to look up every dang name that he mentions, and of course he doesn't say first and last name. It's a private diary. He's just going to
right.
mention the name he knows. So I spent 3 days looking up Willie Rand. 3 days, Steve, and and I got some. It's okay, and some I'm in the middle of, like Norman Hume. You know,
Yeah.
he just I just don't know anything about him, but he's the Anne's grandfather's best friend. And it was just really, it's been a fascinating thing. And I don't know if I'm going to try and do something with that, or if it'll just be an academic thing.
Yeah.
Maybe, but I do try anyway. That's taking a lot. I
Well,
do try.
it might give you a nugget of the of a plot or of a story or of a character that all of a sudden you'll find out, oh, here's another historical novel
Yeah.
to write, right? It's well, it's
Here's
great
the,
that you're keeping yourself evolved in that. Now, let me revisit one more thing about revision. So you went to a conference where your editor beat you up. What a lot of teachers are interested in, and the teachers I taught that were going to be English teachers, we're trying often just to get kids to write a first draft, right? But I'm always trying to uncover the fact that very few writers, or like what isn't it Victor Hugo used to claim he would stand at a podium at a lectern and write and throw the pages on the floor, finished, right? And that's how he wrote. And if you think I believe that, I don't think I believe that, right? But the notion of having this muse give you direct story. So how do you go about doing revision? Do you get a draft first and then go through it? Do you revise as you go? Do you make storyboards? What's your process about revising?
um, I don't use an outline. I don't use storyboards. When I finish my 500 words today, I have no idea what happens tomorrow. I literally have no idea. So the way start a session, a writing session, is that I go to the beginning of the chapter that I'm working on. So say I'm beginning chapter 3 today. I write pages 1 and 2 on Monday. So on Tuesday, when I start, I will revise pages 1 and 2 and write pages 3 and 4. On Wednesday, I'll revise pages 1 to 4 and write pages 5 and 6. It gets me, we need something to sort of slide into the day and get into the
Right.
tone, get into the voice. But that means at the end of 2 weeks, say, I have a draft of a chapter. The first 2 pages of that draft have been revised 9 times. The second 2 8 times, blah blah blah. Um, and so I'm constantly revising as I go along. That means that when I'm done with that chapter, that's set aside, and I go to the next chapter. And I think that has, in fact, affected even the way I think about the books. I mean, so okay, for now that you mentioned, um, has a new each chapter is a new bird, and in a way that kind of feels good to me. Like, okay, I'm done with
Right.
this bird, and I go to the next one. The latest is a book about Hercules, the labors of Hercules. each chapter is one of the labors, and I
Mm.
finish that labor around page 20 or so, and then I'm done, right? Put that aside and I move to the next one, and that keeps me from going totally bonkers. Um, it's not just, oh, I'm going to go here, there, they're everywhere. I try and keep it pretty scheduled, but I also don't worry about what happens tomorrow. And I know it's inefficient. I get that it's not an efficient, right? And I know that there are people who would say, "Oh, come on! I mean, you need to have some outline. You need to go where you need to know where you're heading." But it just doesn't work like that for me. I mean, if you outline everything, everything then is boring, right? I mean, you just fill it in. But I'm discovering tomorrow what happens when you turn from page 4 to 5, just like the reader will. We're in the
Yeah.
same place, and I like that. I love the idea that um, I'll have to come up with something totally new that I have no idea what's going to be tomorrow. And will it stink sometimes? Well, of course. But like the old saw, right? It's not brain surgery. We can always
Yeah.
go back and do it again. And that's how it happens. If it stinks, okay, I throw the chapter out maybe, or I throw 2 pages out, or I go back to where it seems okay.
Yeah.
And but that's it. It's very, very regular. Revise to the beginning of the chapter, from the beginning of the chapter to where I'm stopped, then do 2 pages.
Well, so when you finally get a book, like when the Hercules book is done, do you go back through it all again, try to tighten and see if you've got things? Because sometimes there'll be connections. I'm certainly thinking in OK for Now, there's references to other paintings and you go back and forth. So did that reveal along the way, or does it take an ending revision to get that all together?
Yeah, I take notes along the way. So if I see something that has to go back, I don't go back and do it then, but I take notes about that.
Mhm.
And so that's usually 6 or 8 pages or so of that close scrolled in. And then I think about generally the way, it depends on time too, I suppose. But I start with about 5 pages a day. A year goes by, you finish the first draft. Now I'm going to take 5 pages as a chunk. And when that's all done, I'll take 10 pages at a chunk. Then I'll take a chapter at a chunk. And then I'll hide somewhere, right, for 3 days. And then I'll do the whole book just a couple of times, just go through the whole thing. Because it's so easy to forget, right?
Yeah.
Like, you think that you put something in here, but you haven't, or you think something has been set up because in your head, you've got to,
Yeah.
but you haven't done that yet. So there's a lot that goes on, that way, and that takes a long time for me. I'm not a fast writer, really. I have to go slow through those, so I make sure that everything is set up appropriately and well.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. That's really good. I like the methodical nature. But I'm sure if you've done that, your editor loves you, because for the most part, it's probably pretty clean by the time they get a
I
full
hope so.
book.
Oh yeah, I mean, both Virginia and then I worked with Dinah Stevenson. They don't suffer fools gladly. They were like, yeah, you would not turn something in that wasn't pretty good.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, me
Thanks,
too.
Gary. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.